it's never more true than now that you can only really learn by doing. And I think if we keep that very much to mind now as we enter in this new world of AI, then that can only be a good thing for us and protect against some of these unforeseen circumstances.
Q4 is almost here and the stakes are getting high. Brands are really feeling the pressure and are unsure how to optimize their digital campaigns. But the good news is that Automated Creative have analyzed over 6 billion impressions and surveyed top marketers to deliver vital insights. And we're going to be presenting this at a virtual event called Compounding Creative Effectiveness, an urgent Q4 wake-up call. So boost that Q4 spend, get some actionable steps for success. Let's not just meet those targets, let's go far, far beyond. All the links you need are in the show notes below. Thank you.
My name is Tom Ollerton. I'm the founder of Automated Creative. We're a creative effectiveness ad tech platform. We help turn brands' impressions into intelligence. But part of what we do is we do a podcast. I think we've done about 250 episodes or so. And every week we get to interview significant leaders from the industry about their vision for the future and what is, in fact, their shiny new object. We're going to have a discussion about artificial intelligence today. So I just want to prep it a bit so the way that I'm looking at it at the minute, that AI is unbelievably amazing. And this is a great example of that recently.
A long, long time ago at Lady Winterbottom's lovely tea party, which is
in the smoking ruins and ashes of New York City.
A fierce woman ain't playing no games and is out to kick some butts.
Against the unimaginable, brutal, merciless, and scary
lobby boy of the delightful Grand Budapest Hotel.
Hi.
And everything seems doomed and lost until
a super handsome man arises, the true hero and great mastermind behind all of this.
The really crazy thing about this, though, is there was no code, there was no shoot, there was no nothing. It was just all generated on someone's laptop in a very short amount of time. So, what does that mean for all of our careers? So that's exciting. That's an opportunity. But actually, AI is also quite scary. That Snap has its own AI LLM built into the tool. And I don't know if you've seen this, but someone said, "Do you have access to my location?" "No, I don't." "Where am I?" "I'm sorry, but I don't have access to your information." "Oh, are you lying?" "No, I don't have access to your location." This is quite reassuring. "Where's the closest McDonald's?" "Oh, it's just around the corner." Right, so it's a bit scary. So is it amazing? Is it scary? Don't worry, we have Gerry here. So Gerry, for anyone who doesn't know who you are and what you do, could you give us a quick
So my name's Gerry D'Angelo. I was until very recently the Vice President of Global Media at Procter & Gamble. I've now actually retired from that role, which is a very kind of American way of moving on from an employer. And I'll be starting some advisory roles in September of this year.
Congratulations, man.
Thank you.
So on the podcast, there's kind of fixed questions. And the question that you've chosen is, what advice would you give to a smart, driven student who wants to make it in the industry?
So I think probably the best way of answering that question is, what would be the advice that I would give myself at that stage? And if I look back at my career, I've spent over 30 years working in both agencies and on the corporate side. And I've been very, very lucky. So the advice that I would give to anyone starting in the business, if they're young and hungry and dynamic and determined to get success, is just make room for some luck. Because if I look back at my career, there have been 2 or 3 occasions where luck has played a big part in making the right move at the right time. So taking a step back, letting events kind of play out, and allowing luck to play a role in the development of your career would be the advice that I would give.
Can you just dig into that a little bit? That makes sense.
Sure.
How would someone in the room who's trying to follow your career to a degree, how would you make room for luck? Is that a psychological thing, or are you putting yourself in a position where...
I think probably the best way of putting a pin in that is to say, be curious. So if I look at a couple of the big opportunities that I had, I think one of them came from me absentmindedly scrolling through LinkedIn one Sunday morning, and I just happened to come across a role that looked very interesting. And on the back of curiosity, I kind of double-clicked on that a little bit and was able to to realize it was a really good gig working for Mondelez International at the time in Zurich. And the other one is just be open to conversations, right? At events like this, or more broadly in your career, you just never know where some of those very, very kind of innocent conversations may lead, and network like crazy, and allow your networking to be powered by that level of curiosity.
And another question we always ask on the podcast, and I'm fascinated to know what you're going to come up with, but what is your top marketing tip that spanned your entire career, that you've shared the most often, that you think really represents the one thing that everyone in this room
got it? Okay. So the one thing that I've tried to hold true to throughout my career is understanding the difference between marketing fundamentals and those things that might come along on top of that, that might be very specific tactics that would be relevant to a particular time or a particular place. And that allows you to kind of hold on to things in a way that ultimately will be business drivers. And it means that you don't spend excessive time and energy running after lots and lots of things, where ultimately you'll look back at those things and you'll realize it was somewhat of a box checking exercise and wasn't ultimately ending up in something that was driving the business that you were working for at the time, or your own kind of personal development. So if you can understand and differentiate between those fundamentals and those things that are a little bit more tactical, that kind of might fade over a point in time, then that would be the one thing that I would advise that everyone does in their career.
So now we're going to move on to your shiny new object, which is AI and the future of marketing. No, I think I know what that means.
Right.
What does that mean to you, and why is it your shiny new object?
Well, I think it's hard to ignore because certainly on the back of ChatGPT, from a generative AI perspective, it's absolutely new and it's absolutely shiny, and it cannot be ignored, because every time you flip open Twitter or LinkedIn or even the news, it's absolutely there. So I think it's something that cannot be ignored. And I think the way that certainly the company that I used to work for until very recently, and a number of large other advertisers, we looked at it with genuine enthusiasm. And the reason that I would frame it like that is because there was a degree of innovation fatigue that was settling in. So yes, we had blockchain. Yes, we had NFTs. Yes, we had the metaverse. Yes, we had associated virtual worlds and goods. But over a period of time, it became very obvious that if you're in a large organization that's manufacturing and distributing and retailing physical products in the real world, it was very hard to see the practical application and use cases for many of those things. And I think the difference with AI is that those things almost automatically became evident. So from a media perspective, which was the area of the business that I worked in, you could start to see that AI, in the broadest sense, through the use of technology and data, was already very, very prevalent in our business in the way that decisioning was being made in the media space. And I think now from a creative perspective, you're starting to see those use cases as well. I mean, a great example I can provide on that is a brand manager that was working on a hair care brand was telling me just last week that even in pre-production, using Gen AI to come up with 20 different treatments was done almost at the touch of a button in a way that it would never have been able to have done before.
So I was lucky enough to join a session with your peers on the World Federation of Advertisers,
Yep.
your media group. So you're unbelievably well networked with these other senior media leaders globally. So I'm curious to know how are your peers preparing for this at this high level?
Yeah, I think I could sum it up by saying cautious optimism, because the optimism is coming about through the immediacy of these use cases. But the caution is coming about because we've seen a number of different waves of innovation, and sometimes things can go wrong. And so that cautiousness is being manifested by some guidelines. So when it comes to particularly generative AI, you have to take into account a number of different things. So for example, on IP, you have to be very, very watchful that to what degree is your own IP, how can that be protected when you're using prompts to go into a number of these applications? And also the output of this stuff, you also have to be very, very watchful that the IP can be protected and owned in a way that perhaps it wasn't before. And also things like product claims. So as well as IP, you just need to be very, very careful that any of the outputs from generative AI can withstand scrutiny in terms of challenges around product claims.
This episode of the Shiny New Object podcast is brought to you in partnership with MadFest. Whether it's live in London or streamed online to the global marketing community, you can always expect a distinctive and daring blend of fast-paced content, startup innovation pitches, and unconventional entertainment from MadFest events. You'll find me causing trouble on stage, recording live versions of this podcast, and sharing a beer with the nicest and most influential people in marketing. Check it out at www.madfestlondon.com.
So you don't have a crystal ball, but your opinion is very valid. But what do you think is going to happen in the kind of 6 to 12 month time frame with this stuff? What's your prediction?
So I'd have to answer that from a very personal perspective. But I'm quite glad in a way, because for 10 or 15 years, I've witnessed almost in like real time how the creative side of our business, the creativity, and the technology side of our business are on two very divergent paths. And that's actually been quite sad to see, because you can kind of see them sailing off in different directions. And I think where I'm very hopeful for the future is that generative AI in particular can stave off this somewhat uncomfortable reckoning between the two of those things. And it can in turn become the bridge that starts to put creativity and technology back on a path together. And that can only, I think, be good for the industry more broadly.
And when it comes to these technologies, do you think we should just get on with it? Or do you think there's a certain amount of like self-governance that needs to happen first?
Well, I think we definitely have to get on with things. I think with Gen AI in particular and AI more broadly, it's never more true than now that you can only really learn by doing. And I'm super encouraged to see that experimentation is being encouraged both in large advertiser organizations and also in the agencies. And so I think we have to do that. But we've also got to do that with a very watchful eye on what happened in the past. So there are some things that happened in the past that if we'd had a sense of being able to ask, what could go wrong, we would have ended up with some much better outcomes. And I think probably the biggest learning from that is in the social media space. And I think if we keep that very much to mind now as we enter into this new world of AI, then that can only be a good thing for us and protect against some of these unforeseen circumstances and consequences.
I don't know how much you can talk about this, but as you sort of left P&G, what were you seeing as being the experiments there?
So I think there was clearly a lot of work that was going on in the innovation space. So I think people were really tempted by beginning to understand how they could drive innovation and MPD. And then right at the other end of the scale, there was a lot of functional work that people were beginning to experiment, so that could AI be used to take out a lot of time and manual intervention in those areas. So those are the areas that I think I was seeing the most experimentation on.
And so you mentioned before, like IP and so on, but what do you think the ethical considerations are? I know that there's a lot of challenges that people are making around, well, this has been generated by AI, but that AI was trained on a data set, which tends to be something that a human made. So what's your view on that?
Well, I think the watch outs, you've really got to put this into the bucket of unforeseen consequences, in the sense that, yes, you could take time and cost out of the equation, but what's going to happen in terms of the end product? And I think probably a good example of that, I think it was Amazon that was using AI to filter out CVs for recruitment. And they stopped doing that after about 4 months, because they realized that there was an inbuilt bias in terms of ethnicity and gender that was impacting the number of people of candidates that they were shortlisting. So I think as long as you're asking yourself the question, what could go wrong? What are the unforeseen consequences of some of this work? Then the more guarded you can be against some of those things.
So I was talking at a Google event the other day, which is really interesting, and someone said something that really scared me. And he basically said that these large language models are based on pre-existing content on the internet.
Yeah.
Billions of pages, millions of sites, Wikipedia and so on. And he was talking about an interesting shift between the way you would search for things. Use a search engine. You search for somewhere nice to go on holiday, something to eat tonight. Whereas these large language models are almost a find engine in a way. You immediately arrive at that thing. What should I do this weekend with my 5-year-old? There you go. There's 5 ideas. I don't have to research it. It's kind of been done for me. So there's this idea that what the large language models have been trained on are people contributing to these websites. But if people aren't going to these websites in the first place, they aren't going to contribute. So we're going to have a new form of the internet where we're using these sites a lot less and we're relying on large language models a lot more for answers. And I'm curious to know how you think that will play out and how that affects.
Yeah, I think from a user perspective, the utility is going to be much greater that if you put in a question, a query or a prompt, and you get back a much more kind of holistic answer, it's going to be super useful. So I can understand from a consumer perspective how people will lean into that. But it is going to raise questions from a content perspective. I hadn't really thought about it in those terms. If people weren't going to these sites and creating the content, is this going to kind of create this negative spiral? I hadn't thought about it that way. But I do think about it from an IP and a monetization perspective. Because if content is being scraped relentlessly to create some of these outputs, then what does that really mean for the content providers and how that gets monetized and how people make a living off the back of it? I don't know the answer to that, but I think we certainly need to be asking ourselves some of those questions as these models become more and more prevalent in their usage.
I was watching a presentation by our global head of strategy, Amy Wright, and she was saying that we all need to make a choice between good, fast and cheap. And we've been in the AI automation space as a business for 5 years. And I think what she says is very true. Or someone said recently also, like, shit that arrives at the speed of sound is the speed of light is still shit. Right? And what we find is it's the intersection of these tools that do things very fast with kind of human creative and strategic thought that produces the optimal results. I'm kind of curious to get your view on that.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, look, I certainly accept the premise. What do you say? Good, fast, cheap, and cheap. In an ideal world, you'd have all of those things, I think, but it's very, very hard, I think, to get 100% delivery on all three of those things, and you're going to end up making some compromises somewhere. I think the natural bias is going to be that AI will lend itself to faster and cheaper. And the question mark is going to be around the good piece. And I think on the good piece, it's going to be some questions around the veracity of the content. And for us as big advertisers, that veracity of the content might be in terms of how valid a product claim might be or how ownable a piece of IP might be. But I think going forward, it's going to raise more and more questions about the content, how it gets provided, how it gets created, how it gets generated, how it gets distributed, how it gets funded. And I don't know the answer to that. I think it's going to become increasingly difficult to deliver on all three.
And this kind of technology seems to be available to all. It's quite cheap. It's quite quick. It's quite easy to use. Are there certain brands within, I don't know, like a portfolio, like from P&G that would find more use from it? Or is it everyone should be using these things all the time?
I think it's applicable to all brands. So you're talking particularly from a generative AI perspective or AI more broadly?
From a generative AI perspective.
I think the brands that have a greater degree of or greater potential to drive their business through personalization, there's a more kind of immediate relevance and impact for generative AI. Because I think one of the things that's held true for Procter & Gamble brands or Mondelez brands or any of the other businesses I've worked at in the past is the ability to have a very, very broad-based appeal and create fame on the back of that. And that's been the driver of business success in many cases. However, if you are talking, for example, in the diapers business, then being very, very specific to who you're talking to, and then being able to speak to the pain points for those individuals and then tailor creative on the back of it. And we've certainly seen that with some of the work that we've done with you for SK2 and Herbal Essences, where we've been able to drive much greater or higher effective creative on the back of that, much more quicker to market.
So we're kind of coming to the last minute now. So there's a bunch of people in this room who are excited, maybe slightly worried about the impact of AI. What's the one thing that they should be doing in the next week to help prepare for AI?
I'm going to try and give you a very short answer. So experimentation within guidelines.
Brilliant. And that is a lovely way to finish it. Gerry, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Tom.
Hi. Just before you go, I'd really appreciate it if you could take the time to write a review of the shiny new Object podcast on Apple Podcasts or iTunes, whatever it's called these days, or whichever podcast provider you use. We're an indie podcast, so it would go a long way for us if you could just share the word and give us a bit of a support on those channels. That would just be fantastic. If you haven't got time, that's also cool. And yeah, if you could tell your colleagues about the podcast, and also, if possible, don't forget to subscribe. And I'd love to hear your feedback. If you'd like to speak on the podcast or be a guest, or you think I'm asking the wrong questions, anything, I'd be super interested to hear what you think. So please email me at tom@automatedcreative.net. That's TOM at, I'm not going to bother spelling it. Anyway, you'll work it out. Thanks so much.